For nearly 2 weeks, the United States and the Soviet Union had been locked in a confrontation over Soviet nuclear missiles discovered in Cuba. American forces were on alert, Soviet forces were on alert, and both sides understood that a mistake could become something much larger. October 27, 1962 was called Black Saturday. It was arguably the most dangerous day of the entire Cuban Missile Crisis. On that day, a U.S. plane was shot down over Cuba, and its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., was killed. Another American plane accidentally strayed into Soviet airspace near Siberia, prompting Soviet fighters to scramble. Kennedy and Khrushchev were struggling with competing messages and the terms under which the missiles might be removed. U.S. preparations for a possible invasion of Cuba were advancing. Hundreds of feet beneath the Atlantic, the crew of a Soviet submarine had other problems. They didn't really know what was happening. Their submarine, B-59, had been operating largely out of communication with Moscow. The men aboard didn't know whether the crisis was getting better or worse, and they couldn't be certain that the war hadn't already begun. Now, American ships had found them, and explosions were going off around their submarine. Conditions aboard B-59 were already miserable. The submarine had been designed for colder waters. Here, temperatures inside climbed above 100 degrees. Ventilation was poor. Carbon dioxide was increasing. Fresh water was limited. Men were exhausted. Some were collapsing from the heat, and the submarine's batteries were running dangerously low. Eventually, they would have to surface. But above them were American warships. The Americans kept dropping explosives into the water. To the Americans, these were signals. Inside a steel submarine, they sounded very different. There was something else the Americans didn't know. B-59 was armed with torpedoes. One of them carried a nuclear warhead. The weapon was powerful enough to destroy an American ship and kill thousands of men. And unlike the strategic nuclear missiles controlled from distant command centers, this weapon was already there, inside the submarine, with the men who would have to decide whether to use it. As the hours passed, the situation deteriorated, and explosions continued outside the hull. The submarine's commander faced a terrible possibility. Maybe these weren't warnings. Maybe the war had already started. Eventually, B-59 could remain submerged no longer. It came to the surface. The commander climbed onto the conning tower. Another senior officer climbed up with him. What they encountered looked chaotic. American ships surrounded them. Searchlights swept across the submarine. Aircraft passed extraordinarily low overhead. There appeared to be gunfire. For men who had spent hours believing they might already be under attack, it was easy to imagine the worst. The submarine commander did. He ordered the boat to dive again, and he called for the nuclear torpedo to be prepared. But the officer standing beside him was watching the American actions carefully. His name was Vasily Arkhipov, and this was not his first nuclear emergency. 15 months earlier, Arkhipov had been aboard another Soviet submarine when its nuclear reactor cooling system failed. The crew faced the possibility of a catastrophic reactor accident. There was no adequate backup system, so sailors improvised one. To do it, men entered areas where they were exposed to enormous amounts of radiation. 8 would die within days. Arkhipov survived. What he noticed was that the American aircraft were firing, but something was wrong. They weren't firing at the submarine, they were firing alongside it. The Americans weren't trying to destroy B-59, they were trying to communicate with it. The officer called the commander back. He pointed out what was happening. Wait, look, understand what they're actually doing. The commander reconsidered. The order to prepare the nuclear weapon never reached the men below. B-59 remained on the surface, and gradually the Americans and Soviets began communicating. The dangerous moment passed. B-59 eventually turned toward home. And what waited for the Soviet submariners was not a hero's welcome. The returning crew faced criticism and difficult questioning. Arkhipov remained in the Soviet Navy. He continued to rise through its ranks. Eventually, he became a vice admiral. But what happened aboard B-59 remained largely unknown outside a small circle of Soviet submariners. There was no celebration for the decision Arkhipov had made, no public recognition, and for decades the Americans involved in the encounter didn't even know that the submarine they had been signaling carried a nuclear weapon. Arkhipov finally spoke publicly about what happened aboard B-59 in 1997. He died the following year. Only later did the wider world begin to understand how close those sailors had come to making a decision that could not have been taken back. By then, the quiet Soviet officer at the center of the story was gone. We know that the United States and Soviet Union had not gone to war. We know that the explosives dropped around the submarine were intended as signals. And we know just how dangerous October 27, 1962 really was. But Arkhipov knew none of that. He didn't possess some secret piece of information that everyone else had missed. He simply refused to pretend that he knew something he didn't. He watched, he questioned, and when the evidence didn't support the worst possible conclusion, he said so. Did Arkhipov save the world? We cannot know what would have happened if that nuclear torpedo had been fired. Perhaps the Americans would have somehow recognized that it was an isolated act. Cooler heads might still have prevailed. Or perhaps a nuclear explosion among American warships in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis would have started a chain of events no one could stop. There are moments when courage means refusing to act until you understand what is actually happening. On October 27, 1962, when certainty might have been catastrophic for the world, one man had the courage to admit that he did not know. And that's why Vasily Arkhipov, a Soviet vice admiral, qualifies as a great American.